$2.72 trillion. That's how much the world spent on its military last year. To put that in perspective, that's roughly $10,000 for every single person in the United States, or enough to end world hunger 14 times over. And the scariest part? That number just had its biggest jump in over 30 years. So where is all that money going? Who's spending it? And which countries are tooling up faster than anyone expected? Let's plot it out. Global military spending has been climbing for 10 straight years now. After the Cold War ended, there was a brief period where the world collectively exhaled and spending dropped. But since around 2015, it's been going in one direction, up. And 2024 saw the steepest single-year jump since SIPRI started tracking this data, a 9.4% increase in just 12 months. That's not normal. For context, the average annual increase over the previous decade was about 3%. So something has fundamentally changed, and it's not hard to see why. The war in Ukraine, the conflict in Gaza, rising tensions in the South China Sea. Countries aren't just talking about defense anymore, they're writing the checks. Let's start with who's spending the most. And honestly, this chart barely needs explaining because it's dominated by one country. The United States spent $997 billion on its military in 2024. That's nearly $1 trillion. And it's more than the next 10 countries combined. America accounts for 37% of all military spending on the planet, 37%. One country. China comes in second at $314 billion, which sounds like a lot until you realise it's less than a third of what America spends. Now here's what's interesting. Look at third, fourth, and fifth place. Russia at roughly $125 billion, Germany at $88.5 billion, and India at $84 billion. Germany has jumped into the top 5 for the first time since reunification. That's a massive shift. This is the chart that really hits home, the United States on the left, and the next 10 highest spending countries combined on the right. America still comes out ahead. One country outspends 10 of the world's next biggest militaries put together. But raw spending totals only tell part of the story. The more interesting question is, who's ramping up the fastest? And this is where the data gets really dramatic. Israel's military spending surged by 65% in a single year, driven by the war in Gaza and the conflict with Hezbollah. Their budget went from about $27 billion to over $45 billion. Poland increased spending by 31%, Germany by 28%, the Netherlands by 35%, Sweden by 34%. Japan, a country with a pacifist constitution, increased military spending by 21%. The biggest jump since 1952. If you look at Europe as a whole, the picture is striking. Almost every single country on this map increased military spending in 2024. The only exception, Malta. Every other European nation spent more on defence than the year before. Total European military spending rose by 17% in 1 year. Central and Western Europe alone is up 59% over the last decade. Now, raw dollar figures can be misleading. $1 billion means something very different to the United States than it does to Ukraine. So let's look at military burden, spending as a percentage of GDP. Essentially, how much of a country's entire economy goes to its military. And this completely reshuffles the rankings. Ukraine tops the list at 34% of GDP. More than a third of everything Ukraine's economy produces goes to the military. In fact, Ukraine now spends all of its tax revenue on defence. Every single pound, dollar and hryvnia collected in tax goes straight to the war effort. Israel is second at 8.8%, up from 5.4% just 1 year earlier. Russia sits at 7.1%, and then there's a sharp drop to countries like Algeria, Saudi Arabia, and the United States, which, despite spending nearly $1 trillion, dedicates about 3.4% of its GDP to defence. Here's another way to think about it. Global military spending per person reached $334 in 2024. That's the highest since 1990. Every person on Earth, on average, including children, has $334 spent on weapons and soldiers on their behalf. There's been enormous political pressure on NATO members to hit the alliance's 2% of GDP spending target. So how many actually do? In 2024, 17 out of 30 NATO members reached or passed the 2% mark. That's up from just a handful a few years ago. Poland is the standout at 4.2%, Greece, the United States, the UK, and the Baltic states all clear the line comfortably. But here's the gap that matters. For every NATO member to hit 2%, the alliance would have needed to spend an additional $663 billion. That's 146% more than the countries currently falling short actually spent. The trajectory is clear, though. European NATO spending has been accelerating sharply since Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. And with Germany's recent decision to loosen its fiscal rules, specifically to fund military spending, this trend is only going to continue. So what does all this actually mean? Here's the uncomfortable truth the data reveals. The world is in a genuine arms race, not in the Cold War sense of two superpowers, but a broad, multi-front global escalation. Every single region on Earth increased military spending in 2024. That hasn't happened often in modern history, and there are real trade-offs. The UK, for example, is cutting overseas development aid from 0.5% to 0.3% of national income specifically to redirect that money to defence. That's money that was going to some of the world's poorest countries, now going to the military instead. $2.72 trillion is an almost incomprehensible number. But behind it are real choices being made by real governments about what matters most. And right now the data is clear. The world is choosing to arm. That's the world's military spending, plotted. The data comes from SIPRI's Military Expenditure database. I'll link it below if you want to dig into the numbers yourself. What surprised you most? For me, it was Germany, jumping into the top 5. Drop your answer in the comments.